Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out today on a really glorious Sunday afternoon to spend in a dark auditorium, so we really appreciate it. My name is Spencer Wigmore. I'm the Patrick and Amy Butler Associate Curator of American Painting here at MIA, and I'm also the curator of the special exhibition Built to Last, the Shogren-Meyer collection of American art, which is what we're celebrating in today's lecture. Built to Last was a really extraordinary project to get to work with because of the opportunity it gave us here at MIA to work really closely with collectors who have really made a very specific aspect of American art a really core passion. Dan Shogren and Susan Meyer are Twin Cities collectors and longtime MIA supporters who have amassed a really remarkable collection of what they call industrial art. Paintings and sculptures from the 1920s to the 1940s, a real emphasis on the Great Depression that center on scenes of work, particularly within the context of heavy industry, steelwork, mining, agriculture, as well as labor activism and the environmental history of the Dust Bowl. It's just a real treasure trove of material, and the goal of this exhibition was to kind of come up with a selection of highlight pieces that narrate an emotional spectrum of responses to the theme of industry during the Depression, ranging from real celebrations of work in industry, say within the context of corporate advertising, to stark scenes of destitution and economic hardship on the flip side of that. So it's a really remarkable array of work that I think shows the extent to which this material, these motifs could respond to so many different social currents of the era. And this photo for me by Walker Evans is in many ways the emblematic image of this show, which famously portraying Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, takes these markers of home, working, and spiritual life and puts them into intimate, inescapable proximity to one another in a really extraordinary and kind of ambivalent response to the sort of the inescapable presence of work. I also, before introducing our speaker, want to extend a hearty thanks to Dan and Susan, who have been such great collaborators from start to finish with this project. Talking through individual pieces, working out selections has been a really enjoyable experience. And I want to thank them as well for generously sponsoring today's lecture. Which is one of several upcoming programs that I wanted to briefly highlight in addition to the afternoon we're going to spend together today. This coming Thursday, if you come out to the gallery, you can spend some time with Dan, Susan, and myself talking about what it was like not only to put this show together in conversation, but also to learn a little bit more about what it's like to collect American art. You know, how does that perspective sort of shape or engage one's approach to history? I think it's going to be a really exciting thing for us to discuss. And then on June 10th, during the last week of the show, we're fortunate to have artist, writer, and educator Brooks Turner, who takes as his subject Minneapolis labor history as the prompt for his own art making, is going to speak with us about the ways that labor activism informs his own creative practice, with a lot of this work from the 30s being really central to his thinking. So with that in mind, I'm thrilled today to introduce Erika Doss, a distinguished professor in the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas. Her wide-ranging interests in modern and contemporary art are reflected in the breadth of her publications, including Benton Pollock and the Politics of Modernism, From Regionalism to Abstract Expressionism, which in 1991 received the Charles C. Eldridge Prize, basically the Oscar for Best Picture in the American art world. She's also written Spirit Poles and Flying Pigs, Public Art and Cultural Democracy in American Communities. Great title. Elvis Culture, Looking at Life magazine, The Emotional Life of Contemporary Public Memorials, Memorial Mania, Public Feeling in America, which I've read several times and is just great, Monumental Troubles, Rethinking What Monuments Mean Today, and Spiritual Moderns, 20th Century American Artists and Religion in 2023. She's the recipient of several Fulbright Awards. I admittedly didn't know you could get more than one, so that's pretty cool. Doss has also held fellowships at the Stanford Humanities Center, the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum Research Center, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies, and Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Erika Doss.
Thank you, Spencer. And I'd like to thank the Minneapolis Institute of Art for organizing the exhibit Built to Last, and I hope everybody gets a chance to see it. Susan Meyer and Dan Shogren's collection of some 40 artworks, part of a much larger collection created during the Great Depression, focusing on paintings and photographs, some produced under the New Deal's federally funded art projects, some produced or reproduced in the pages or here on the cover of Life magazine. This collection and this exhibit inform us about how a diverse body of American artists represented work and workers at a crucial historical moment. For centuries, Americans have been encouraged to believe that work is indispensable to human flourishing. Reverence for work and faith in the work ethic, what some call workism, has played a major role in shaping self and civic identity from the Republican era of the early 19th century well through to the present day. It's a commonplace assumption that what we do as Americans is often the most outstanding indicator of who we are. Think of the first question we often ask people when we meet them in social settings or even at parties. Hi, what do you do? We are taught that work not only defines us, it dignifies us. Work hard, and you will be rewarded. By extension, the meaning of work is a crucial moral link between individuals and public life is so strong it almost might be called a calling that ties individual Americans to the larger national community that is the United States. Today, in the 21st century realities of post-industrial capitalism and AI, the meaning and the sustainability of the work ethic, this calling, is in jeopardy. And I think you all know what I'm talking about because this just seems to be in the news constantly. The future of work, we are warned, is under threat. And I think what this does is prompt us to speculate about whether or not the work ethic was ever really our dominant cultural mythology. And if it was, to interrogate its multiple contradictions and many disappointments, its impossible promises, and our own alienation from workism. Now, as an American art historian, American art, I think, is a great place to start. Given this nation's much vaunted esteem for work, it's interesting that American art, and American modern art in particular, reveals a much more ambiguous, critical, and even oppositional representation of labor, laborers, and the supposed relevance and dignity of work and the workplace. Even when issues of labor and capital, work and wages were central to the nation's political and social life, such as in the late 19th century, art representing work and workers was relatively sparse, largely underappreciated, and biased in favor of, not surprisingly, labor management. In the 1880s, for example, printmaker Joseph Pennell, whose work we see here, proposed an illustrated study he called The Picturesque Possibilities of Work. He found no takers. Not surprising. Now, Pennell had published this wood engraving of a Philadelphia oil refinery in Scribner's Monthly, and he had also produced watercolors of the nearby Bethlehem steelworks. And he expected Gilded Age viewers to be similarly enthused with his views of what one art historian calls a transcendent industrial sublime. Rebuffed, he went to Europe and sketched cathedrals, similarly focusing on their imposing architectural forms. Returning a couple of decades later to the United States, Pennell returned to pictures of factories and steel mills and skyscrapers, retaining a similar sort of visual vocabulary that cast modern industrial architecture on equally monumental and even spiritual terms. In the background of his etching that we see on the right of the gigantic concrete-filled caissons used to secure the foundations of the corporate headquarters of the New York Telephone Company, which is being built sort of there in the front. In the background, we see the soaring shape of the 57-story Woolworth building, which was then the world's tallest building. And note how the pointed gables of the building mimic those of a Gothic cathedral. Pennell collected all of his prints, and he finally got his wish. We have the book, Pictures of the Wonder of Work here, and told people, today we have our monuments in the great industrial works, the modern temples, the shrines of work. To sort of give us a context, here is a drawing that he did on the left of flour mills in Minneapolis, and then we have Gary, Indiana on the right. Pennell's work is grounded in what we might call progressive era positivism that rarely included workers in these shrines or questioned the human and environmental terms of modern industry. His smoky, blurry images were dramatic and romantic, and they aimed at mystery and awe and human invisibility. Smoke symbolized production, shrouding modern factories and urban settings in secrecy and effectively hiding the problem of the worker and the tensions of industrial labor, including class conflict and worker autonomy. Lecturing on his industrial subjects, Pennell told one audience that while the coming of electricity would make for a cleaner and more healthful environment, it will also destroy the city's picturesqueness by eliminating the smoke. So you see where I'm coming from here. He's all about the smoke. American sculptors and also muralists of the day produced similarly what I would call fanciful depictions of workers and the workplace. Douglas Tilden's Mechanics Monument, which was funded by the family of Peter Donahue, the founder of California's first ironworks, depicts 5 guys clad in skimpy loincloths and leather aprons. And they're all struggling to operate a punch press, an industrial machine used to cut and shape sheet metal. At the base, he included, and you can see on the bottom on the far right, portraits of his patrons. Now, 1901. This is what Union Ironworks looked like in San Francisco in 1900. It was a massive industrial plant. It employed over 3,500 men, and it built ships for the US Navy. As Melissa DeBacchus explains, Tilden's homage elided the contemporary class and ethnic tensions troubling early 20th century San Francisco to perpetuate the myth of the white male taming the wild frontier, or whatever it is those guys are doing. Other people, including his contemporary, the sculptor Laredo Taft, called his art bizarre and restless, but Tilden proclaimed it was the greatest apotheosis of labor in the world. We see a similar sort of depiction in John White Alexander's massive 4,000 square foot mural, The Crowning of Labor, which was commissioned for the Carnegie Museum of Art in 1907, which similarly elided the subjects and tensions of modern day industry and wage labor. in favor of an eroticized white male body. Panels on the first floor, for example, depict smoky factories, construction sites, and muscular male workers, although the two subjects, interestingly, the worker and the workplace, are represented in separate panels. The second floor features a panel titled Apotheosis of Pittsburgh. Lots of apotheosis from these guys. Apotheosis of Pittsburgh, an idealized depiction of steel industry mogul Andrew Carnegie, the museum and Pittsburgh's primary patron, dressed as a knight in a suit of armor and being crowned by a partially nude female for his philanthropy. Aligned with their corporate patrons, artists like Tilden and Alexander ennobled industrial capitalism by rendering the modern worker largely invisible. Although specialization, mechanization, and scientific management had transformed the nature of labor in the United States from craft to operative work, they reified artisanal labor, or artisanal craftsmanship, and a romantic pre-industrial ideal of the work ethic. Doing so, they glossed over the grueling toil of pre-industrial labor and ignored the real-time, real-life circumstances of modern-day work, including large-scale machines, factories, assembly lines, mass production, and labor activism from strikes to unions. Note how Alexander's idealized workers are contained within the billowing white clouds of industry. And note how none of these guys are wearing job-appropriate clothing. Precisionist moderns like Charles Demuth lampooned industrial age icons and their adulation in paintings like My Egypt, a portrait of a grain elevator in the artist's hometown. Seemingly an exaltation of modern industrial architecture, note that the grain elevators are illuminated by heavenly rays or maybe Klieg lights. The title references the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs and the slaves that built them, and thus I think subtly alludes to the similarly dehumanizing circumstances of work and workers in modern industrial America. In 1927, Charles Sheeler was hired by the N.W. Ayer Advertising Company to promote Henry Ford's River Rouge plant, located just outside of Detroit. Built to produce some 12,000 Model A cars a day, the Rouge was a sprawling, self-contained industrial city of some 1,100 acres that employed 75,000 workers in a very fast-paced factory atmosphere where Frederick Taylor's principles of scientific management and labor efficiency held sway. Sheeler spent 6 weeks at the factory producing a number of reductive photographs and paintings that, much like Joseph Pennell's prints, celebrated the industrial landscape as an impressive space of modern rationality and order, dynamism, although here on a more subtle sort of tone, stripped bare of what he and Henry Ford perceived as problematic subjects like workers. His pictures were widely reproduced in Henry Ford's in-house publications and also in magazines like Vanity Fair, where the Rouge factory was described as, quote, the most significant public monument in America and an American altar of the most significant objective of mass production. For Sheeler, the wonder of work was an awe-inspiring and largely uninhabited factory. Note the caption, if you can see it, for the Vanity Fair article, which reads, "By their works ye shall know them," a biblical reference, but something in Vanity Fair which is implying that the work of industrial architecture is prophetic, not the work of the actual workers at this plant. Now, let's face it, work is not exactly the most thrilling visual subject. And I think that's apparent in this sort of documentary photograph by Jack Delano of the interior of a wartime aircraft factory. Or think about what we include in our scrapbooks, our personal scrapbooks. How many of us have photographs of where we have worked or pictures of ourselves at work? I mean, that's not the stuff we usually put in our scrapbooks. Nor are artists especially welcome in the workplace. Workers, after all, are supposed to be working, and artists, especially during periods of labor unrest, tend to be viewed with suspicion as outsiders or perhaps as rabble-rousers. Louis Hine was hired by the National Child Labor Committee, a progressive-era reform organization chartered by Congress in 1907 to document children working on farms and in factories. He worked surreptitiously, posing as a Bible salesman or a fire safety inspector to gain access to places that were meant to be hidden from public scrutiny, like this Indiana glassworks factory, where we see young boys working the night shift. His later work, including this photograph, which is included in the Built to Last exhibit, shifted from images of worker exploitation to images of workers as masters of machines. In 1932, Hine published Men at Work, a photo book of working class American men in urban and industrial settings. These iconic representations of modern workers were intended as counter-narratives to the mechanization, the alienation of industrial labor. He called them work portraits, and he extolled the concentration, the skill, the dignity of his mostly male subjects. His aim, he later remarked, was to show not industry in a positive light, but the worker, to show the importance of human labor at a time in the 1920s when public attention was obsessed with the machine as the genius of America. He added, the character of the men is being put into the motors, the airplane, the dynamos, upon which the life and happiness of millions of us depend. Diego Rivera was committed to a similar vision of worker agency and worker independence, and I think that's especially realized in these terrific murals, Detroit Industry. He was hired, like Charles Sheeler, to depict Ford's industrial workplace, and was commissioned by Edsel Ford, son of Henry, to paint the walls of the Detroit Institute of Art's Garden Court. I highly recommend a trip to Detroit to go see these. These are fantastic murals. Rivera spent a month touring and sketching the River Rouge factory and incorporated many of his drawings directly into the mural's 27 panels. As a Marxist who believed that the leadership of the working class could positively transform the world, Rivera's scenes of the Ford plant's assembly lines promoted worker control and the human benefits of technology, not simply industrial efficiency and the glory of the machine. Detailing, as we see here, the manufacture of Ford's new V8 engine at the Rouge, Rivera emphasized the harmony of man and machines and his political faith in the working class. Hine's and Rivera's images were enormously influential during the Great Depression, when work was considered and was celebrated as the single most important factor in reviving the US economy. Their visual strategies of representation were appropriated by many of the artists in the Built to Last exhibit, including photographer Russell Lee and painter Edmund Lewandowski, both of whom highlight the technical knowledge, the focused concentration of their working class subjects. The lumberjack on the left is standing on the trunk of an enormous tree, holding a curved metal cant hook called a dog that grips and pivots heavy logs and sort of rolls them and gets them ready to be shipped down rivers or cut up. Lewandowski's painting depicts what we call buoy tenders on the Great Lakes, a term used to describe both the seagoing vessels used to maintain and replace navigational buoys, but also the workers who operate them. And note, too, in Lewandowski's painting, a rendering of an integrated workplace. The Great Depression officially began with the 1929 stock market crash and continued into the early 1940s. It was exacerbated by drought and by Dust Bowl conditions, as 100 million acres of native grassland had been dug up and plowed over, a devastating form of sod busting that turned the Great Plains into one of the worst man-made ecological disasters in U.S. history. Massive dust blizzards swept through the plains, as captured in the photograph that we see on the right. That's not a mountain, that's a cloud, which this photograph is included in the exhibit. On April 14, 1935, for example, a rolling wall of dirt 1,000 feet tall, described by one Kansas woman as a menacing curtain of boiling black dust, moved across the Great Plains for hours, dumping huge drifts of dirt and sand all over the region. Photographs like these, and photographs like these, which are also in the exhibit, documented how residents coped, donning masks to filter out the dust and prevent what was called dust pneumonia. Nationwide, jobs disappeared. The unemployment rate rose to 25% by 1933. In Lowell, Massachusetts, full of textile mills, it reached over 90%. In Kentucky, 50% of the state's coal miners were out of work, and 50% of the coal mines were shut down. Wages for those who still had jobs plummeted by 40 to 60%. Losing their homes, losing their jobs, people depended on privately run charities for meals. The White Angel Bread Line, a San Francisco soup kitchen located on a vacant lot near the Embarcadero and near Dorothea Lange's studio, fed more than 2,000 men each day. Lange's photograph, which we see here and is included in the exhibit, and the photographs in her contact sheet capture their despair, their alienation, shown together in need. But, and I think it's really interesting to compare the way the figure is turned toward us in the big photograph, and then also look at the smaller pictures of men eating, each also believing, maybe being encouraged to believe, that their unemployment was their fault, an individual failing. Many Americans lived in makeshift shacks and shanty towns nicknamed Hoovervilles after hapless US President Herbert Hoover, who insisted that the Depression was just a recession and refused social and political demands for federal intervention. The Hooverville that we see in Seattle on the right was mainly occupied by unemployed lumberjacks. Multiple American artists depicted the dire conditions of the Great Depression. In this painting, Sharecroppers' Revolt, Joseph Force depicted a scene from January 1939 when over 2,000 mostly black sharecroppers and their families set up protest camps along two southeast Missouri state highways to call attention to unfair labor practices and to protest against the New Deal's Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938, which gave farmers subsidies to not plant in order to increase market value of their crops. The farmers who got the subsidies were supposed to share those subsidies with their unemployed sharecroppers, but they fired them instead. And that's what these protests were all about. In this 1938 photograph, Marion Post Wolcott documented the dire conditions in Appalachian coal country. And I note that other copies of this photograph describe the child as the daughter of an unemployed coal miner. Harry Gottlieb's painting, An Industrial Landscape, similarly projects the wretched landscape of modern steel, from the slag heaps in red to worker housing. This is a far cry from the transcendent industrial sublime imagined by Joseph Pennell. I note, too, that Gottlieb studied here at the Minneapolis Institute of Art from 1915 to 1917, and then settled in New York. In 1929, the art market collapsed, along with the stock market. Private patronage vanished. Art sales plummeted. Museums closed or slashed their exhibition schedules. Book sales fell by 50%. 70% of the country's musicians were unemployed. Untold numbers of Americans roamed the streets and the countryside or camped out in public parks, frozen in depression, waiting for relief. In 1923, Reginald Marsh painted a New York crew of construction workers framing the steel beams of a new skyscraper. This is included in the exhibit, and I think it's the earliest painting in the exhibit. A decade later, Marsh painted this scene of jobless Americans sitting around Henry Kirk Brown's enormous equestrian statue of George Washington, dedicated in New York's Union Square in 1855. Depicting dark, threatening clouds in the skies above a grim-faced president, Marsh hinted at the serious need for strong national leadership in the Great Depression. And that leadership came in the form of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, US president from 1933 to 1945. From his first day in office, March 4, 1933, FDR went to work crafting the New Deal, a series of political measures, economic programs, and cultural projects aimed at providing relief, recovery, and reform. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, FDR declared at his inaugural address. His confident rhetoric was matched by decisive federal acts and measures, the repeal of prohibition, the creation of Social Security, the institution of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the development of dozens of new federal government agencies, including the AAA, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the NRA, not what you think it is, this is the National Recovery Administration, the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission. Among these alphabet agencies were several New Deal art programs or projects. The first was a short-lived 6-month program called the Public Works of Art Project, or the PWAP, which funded a variety of public murals, including these in San Francisco and Coit Tower. Altogether, there were perhaps 17,000 artists employed for the 6-month period in 1934, and dozens of murals and sculptures that were actually created. Another project was the Section of Fine Arts, which managed the Public Art Commission for new federal buildings, such as post offices, courthouses, and the Wilbur Cohen Building in Washington, which was built to house the Department of Social Security. And the section ran from about 1934 to 1943. And you may have heard that the Cohen Building murals, the Cohen Building in large, are under threat, and we can talk about that a little bit more during Q&A if you'd like. These are just some of the 27 murals that are in that building. And the third art project was TRAP, or the Treasury Relief Art Project, which hired artists to decorate federal buildings, including hospitals, schools, and public housing. And this ran from 1935 to 1938. And here we see some sculptures from Heinz Warnecke, stone figures that were designed for the Harlem River houses in New York. The largest New Deal art agency, the largest New Deal agency was the WPA, the Work Progress Administration, which employed over 8.5 million Americans during its 8 years of funding, which began in 1935, effectively becoming the nation's largest employer. Through its federal art project, the or FAP, which was branded in red, white, and blue with the logo of an eagle and a palette. Can't get more blunt than that. The WPA employed thousands of American artists, painters, sculptors, printmakers, architects, musicians, actors, dancers, poets, who produced murals, easel paintings, posters, photographs, sculptures, dioramas, set designs, dolls, museum exhibits, put on concerts, organized community art centers, and more. Unemployed artists found jobs, honed their creative skills, and helped to foster mid-20th century public interest in American culture, from visual to performing arts. Think about it, a lot of baby boomers, we grew up with music in our schools. Maybe in 5th grade or 7th grade, we were given an opportunity to select an instrument. I picked French horn. I lasted about 3 days, then went to flute, then quit. But for a lot of people, this was an introduction to music. It was offered through the public schools, and a lot of people went on to become accomplished musicians. That started during the Great Depression and under the New Deal. Wages were low, about $25 a week for artists, just enough to live on, as many artists working on the projects remarked. And in 1939, the arts administrators replaced the word progress with the word projects. I emphasize the word work because the art projects funded by the federal government during the Great Depression and enacted at various state and local levels were first and foremost work relief projects. As WPA head Harry Hopkins reminded his staff in 1935, never forget that the objective of this whole project is taking 3.5 million people off of relief and putting them to work. The secondary objective is to put them to work on the best possible projects we can, but we don't want to forget that first objective. And when private patterns of work resurfaced in the early 1940s or reinstated in the American economy, these federal work projects were axed. So New Deal art projects were primarily aimed at employing and keeping busy Americans who might otherwise take to the streets to challenge established economic and political norms. They hinged then on rebuilding national unity and restoring national confidence in American patterns of capitalism and democracy, both of which were sorely tested by the exigencies of the Great Depression. However much the art of the New Deal varied in terms of style and subject, and it did vary, it largely aimed to reaffirm core American values like the work ethic. And yet, the results were not as simple or propagandistic as that cultural mandate might suggest. The art of the 1930s, including New Deal art, was remarkably pluralistic, surprisingly innovative, and often at odds with more traditional and more conservative understandings of art in America. Consider the contrast here between these two works, also included in the exhibit. We have Charles Jesse Child's crisp, precisionist painting of the interior of a steel mill, and we can see tiny figures at work. And then we have Walker Evans' photograph of industrial steel's afterlife, a graveyard of ruined cars near Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. American art during the Great Depression represented the nation's cultural pluralism, its multiple regional identities. It was complicated, in other words, complications that arose from rethinking what American national identity actually was at a time of crisis, and reckoning with persistent tensions of class, race, and gender. And yet, this emphasis on work, on the work ethic, and the primary driving importance of work was this constant theme. Various government branches promoted this theme in various New Deal projects. One of the best known that we think about today was the Farm Security Administration, established in 1935 as a branch of the Department of Agriculture. The FSA was responsible for the New Deal's extensive documentary photography projects. And you can find these at the Library of Congress. These are all the property of the US government. Hundreds of thousands of photographs were made. You can just kind of go through the Library of Congress website and see tens of thousands of photographs. Photographers were sent on assignment all over the country to document how Americans were affected by the Great Depression and to provide a photographic record illustrating the need and effectiveness of various New Deal programs. Ben Shahn photographed cotton pickers in Arkansas. Russell Lee photographed lumberjacks in the Pacific Northwest. And Walker Evans photographed the overarching dominance of Bethlehem Steel, which at full capacity employed more than half of the people who lived in that Pennsylvania city. I just wanted to add this photograph. The mill is closed now, but those massive blast furnaces still loom over the city. And this is an incredible photograph from just a few years ago. There's also a great photograph upstairs by, is it Alex Soth, of Bethlehem Steel. It's got his car right there, and he's trying to, take the same sort of photograph that Walker Evans had done. It's a great photo. Initially, the FSA was tasked with documenting the need to resettle destitute or low-income families from rural and urban areas in improved and often cooperative communities. And I'm thinking, for example, of Greenbelt, Maryland, which was an entirely new, put-together town. Arthur Rothstein's photo that we see here of a family living in a shanty in Herrin, Illinois, was the fodder for New Deal reforms, from old housing to new, from poor land use to better land use. As Rothstein later remarked, it was our job to document the problems of the Depression so we could justify the New Deal legislation that was designed to alleviate them. Now, this is tricky. The photographer was given the task of evoking sympathy and empathy, but also picturing the capacity of destitute Americans to rise out of dire circumstances, if given just a little bit of help, of relief, of assistance. And I just wanted to point out the distinction here between the old grumpy farmer on the left and the very healthy woman and her child on the right. So we go from bad farm to good farm, from toward, this progressive sensibility that sort of underlies these New Deal reforms. Dorothea Lange came across this scene of a family of stranded migrant workers in Nepoma, California in March of 1936, and very quickly, she was only there 10 minutes, shot several photos. The image that became the national icon of the Great Depression, and perhaps some argue, the most widely reproduced photograph in the entire history of photography, is that of this 32-year-old woman named Florence Thompson, seated inside a makeshift tent with 3 of her 7 children. The paradox of the iconicity of this photograph, Sally Stein observes, is that the trope of motherhood powered over that of ethnicity. Born in Oklahoma Indian Territory in 1903, Florence Thompson was Cherokee. An omission of identity in the photograph's original use as a mainstream Anglo icon of Depression-era poverty and need. Here we see a comparison of Lange's 1936 photograph and a picture of Thompson and her family taken in 1979. Note, too, that the essay's supposedly objective documentary photography was often, in fact, carefully calibrated and retouched. The image of a thumb grasping the wooden pole on the far right of Lange's photo is deleted in the most widely reproduced version of her iconic picture. So there's actually 4 kids in this picture, not just 3. FSA photographs were widely distributed to Congress to demonstrate the need for federal funding to support New Deal initiatives, in exhibits and in mass media. The New Deal took full advantage of modern public relations. Schools, museums, and libraries could order New Deal photographs from the Library of Congress at nominal cost and then display them in hallways and in galleries. More than 500 audience comment cards were collected from the audience for this 1938 exhibit at the Grand Central Palace in Midtown Manhattan, including one from a man in the Bronx who wrote, "These pictures are the most human, forceful, and interesting pictures I have seen of the South. Money spent on these pictures is well worth it. Let the public see what is happening away from their front yard." Also well received were the many post office murals that were commissioned through the Treasury and the Section projects. And several artists in Built to Last were awarded Section post office mural commissions, including Edmund Lewandowski, who painted the scene that we see here, titled Hog Raising, for the post office in Caledonia, Minnesota. I hope somebody goes there. Southeast Minnesota, I'm not sure, southwest. This was built in 1939 with Treasury Department funds. And we also have Ernest Fien, who painted this mural celebrating Paul Revere's first successful copper rolling mill. This was painted for a post office in Canton, Massachusetts. Joe Jones painted several murals for post offices in Kansas for towns that had been ravaged by the Dust Bowl, many of whom still in the late 1930s featured huge eroded gullies of dirt along their highways. His mural that we see here for Seneca, titled Men and Wheat, focuses on two guys harvesting a huge field with a tractor and a combine and is seemingly devoid of any Dust Bowl reference. His post office mural for Anthony, Kansas, however, titled Turning a Corner, seems much the same until we note, as art historian Michaela Reif observes, that huge, threatening black cloud in back of that line of train cars on the far right. Although Jones explained that his main artistic interest was in portraying man at work, his job before him, and how he goes about it with his tools, man creating, man doing his work efficiently and under control, he was also keenly aware of the multiple factors and circumstances that made work and worker control untenable. The New Dealers who funded these murals and much other art project during the 1930s and 40s believed, as I said, that gainful employment was the single most important factor in reviving the US economy and restoring American dignity. And a diverse body of American artists of the 1930s and the 1940s, from photographers like Harold Halliday Costain, and we see a worker here who is digging up salt, and painters like Joe Jones, another work by him on the right, to illustrators like Thornton Oakley, were very happy to comply with this theme, with this request, quite literally responding to the crisis of the Great Depression with images celebrating work and workers. In both private commissions and public art, artists of the New Deal depicted American wage laborers as heroic figures of action and autonomy and as exemplars of the work ethic. An iconography of labor, which I think is typified here in these immense sculptures at the entrance of the Federal Trade Commission building in Washington, was courted by New Deal artists and administrators alike who recognized the powerful social, political, and moral uplift of scenes and pictures of rugged, forceful workers. Ironically, when social and industrial progress seemed at its most inert, New Deal artists depicted dynamic workers, as if these painted and sculpted symbols of manly might and manly motion might actually propel the nation itself out of its economic slump. Images of manly, muscular producers helped to deflect Depression-era anxieties about unemployment and undercut worries about the roles and responsibilities of masculine breadwinners. And this focus on men was deliberate. Labor was perceived as on manly terms in so much New Deal art, and women were most often depicted in terms of marital partnership and motherhood. Americans were all workers, but their work was gendered. Louise Ronnebeck's mural, painted in 1940 for the post office in Colorado, in Grand Junction, Colorado, and it's been removed and it's now in a museum, depicts a young couple harvesting peaches on Colorado's western slope. It also depicts the conquest of the American West by European colonists seen on the right and the forced removal of indigenous Americans, which we see on the left. If Ronnebeck's composition then challenged a manifest destiny interpretation of American history by at least acknowledging processes of colonization and removal, it also idealized work and heteronormative gender roles. Both her mural and Hine Gross's similarly titled sculpture, which was shown at the 1939 New York World's Fair, demonstrate the New Deal trope of what historian Barbara Malash calls the comradely ideal. Men and women working together as comrades on the family farm. Now, the Great Depression wreaked havoc on the American family, especially as male breadwinners abandoned families in search of opportunities elsewhere. The divorce rate skyrocketed in the 1930s, and the birth rate plummeted. New Deal art like Ronnebeck's, her mural, and Hine Gross's sculpture bolstered mainstream ideas about social order, about traditional gender roles, and the sanctity of the American family. Now, of course, scenes of joblessness and working class struggle were not uncommon during the Great Depression. As historian Michael Denning argues, the 1930s and the 1940s saw the laboring of American culture, a cultural front of labor unionists, communists, independent socialists, anti-fascists, and others. If artists like Marion Walcott, post-Walcott, and Joseph Vorse pictured the despair and alienation of America's working classes, artists like Louis Rubinstein transferred that despair into dissent, capturing the era's general strikes, labor slowdowns, and calls to action. Here we see Rubinstein's depiction of some of the 43,000 unemployed workers, mostly World War I veterans, who marched on Washington in 1932 to demand payment of promised wartime service bonuses, and their forceful eviction by US troops using tear gas, tanks, and guns. And you can see a line of police in the far back. Leon Bibble's Flag Bearers shows protesters breaking through a wooden frame. It might be a visual metaphor for a picture frame, raising their fist, hoisting the flag, striking for a cause. His painting most likely references a strike organized by the Artists Union in New York in December of 1936, a protest against the job and wage cuts to various New Deal art projects, particularly federal theater projects in 1936, but also others. Still, I think the dominating image of work in the 1930s and in the 1940s was more akin to this. Seymour Fogle's scene, like this one, another mural painted for the Cohen Building, representing work as mastery, the vehicle to the planned future of brains, not brawn. So what do we see? We see the drafting triangle, the designer's compass, lab instruments, the tools of progress. We also see the contrast between skilled and manual labor, scientists and engineers pursuing research and planning, while a faceless and bare-chested man pulls a lever, and then two blue-collar laborers leave for the day. The future of work, Fogel implied, was white-collar work, suggesting that the manly manual laborers celebrated in so much art of the 1930s and 40s were tropes of Depression-era fantasy. And in many ways, the art of the Great Depression was fantastic, a utopian challenge to traditional conservative assumptions about what American art should be, who was an American artist, American art audiences. It was an ambitious embrace of inclusion of women artists, of artists of color, and it demonstrates a surprising tolerance for aesthetic diversity. This was a radically democratic understanding of the possibilities of visual and public art. Today, amidst the 90th anniversary of the New Deal art projects, the field of New Deal art studies and research on the art of the 1930s and 1940s is ripe for further discovery, further analysis, as exhibits like Built to Last certainly demonstrate. The ways in which workers and the work ethic were represented during the Great Depression provide plentiful opportunities for us to engage with our feelings, our expectations about the meaning of work today, and maybe imagine alternatives. Thank you. And I'd be happy to take any questions, or if you have to leave, it's okay. So, comments? Lisa.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can you talk a little bit more about you talked about at-risk things?
The Cohen Building? Sure.
And who owns the public art now?
That's a good question. So we do. The art of the New Deal is the property of the U.S. government. We are the U.S. government. All right, the Cohen Building was built to be the headquarters of the Department of Social Security. It was never the Department of Social Security because the Defense Department, the War Department, moved in because it was completed in 40 and we knew what was happening. Eventually, the Pentagon was built, so the Defense Department goes over there. And the building, which was named the Cohen Building after a senator who had really supported Social Security, began to house all sorts of things, including Voice of America. So Voice of America did its broadcasting to 180 different countries out of the Cohen Building, which is a 2 million square foot building, 5 stories tall. It is huge. It's right kitty corner from the National Museum of the American Indian. None of us have ever been in it, because unless you actually worked there, you can't actually get in. But they're opening it up for tours, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Last year, a list was announced of buildings that are under threat and could be torn down for real estate development. The Cohen Building is one of them. Now, this building has the Ben Shahn murals, the Seymour Fogel murals, murals by the Magnafin twins. It's full of green Travertine marble. It's an incredible space. But we must also recognize that Washington needs public housing, and that area of Washington could probably stand development. So a feasibility study was done to see what the possibilities were. That study was apparently squashed, and now it's one of dozens of buildings that is just sort of available. The GSA, recognizing the threats against it, is offering tours. So I'm really excited to go on a tour next month in Washington and get inside this building and see some of these great murals. So it's under risk. There's a petition that's been signed by almost 10,000 people at change.org. I encourage you to go look at it if you're interested in saving the building. I mean, I'm not a proponent of historical preservation for historical preservation's sake, but wouldn't this be a great space for, I don't know, a museum of New Deal art and housing and McDonald's and whatever else, but it's an incredible space. So to the question of who owns, when those photographs were distributed, when you could buy those photographs. Or even in 1943, when a woman who was in charge of the warehouse of New Deal stuff in Chicago, when she allocated tens of thousands of things to schools, courthouses, there was a 1939 law, which was, this is the property of the US government. You can hold on to it, but you can't sell it. So we, theoretically, the people of the United States, own and possess all of this New Deal art. Problem. Where is it? Who holds onto it? Well, the GSA, the General Services Administration, which was authorized by Congress in 1949, is in charge, but they were recently decimated in terms of their numbers, and they've never been put to full force in terms of managing, collecting, archiving New Deal art. So it floats all over. Lots of it goes up for sale, I mean, it's a problem, as is the problem of work. But it's something to think about. Anyhow, if you got the New Deal stuff, it was marked on the back, property of the U.S. government, not for resale. So keep that in mind. Any other questions or comments?
You know, Erika, you got lots of FSA photographs here. Maybe you can comment on propaganda. You know, was this, propaganda to get things done, and then it kind of moved right into World War II also? What's your opinion on that?
Sure. And I think there are varying levels of propaganda, absolutely. I don't think it was quite as propagandistic as some of the similar sort of work being produced in Germany, Italy, elsewhere. And I emphasize that because there's so much diversity, there's so much optimism, there's a different kind of approach in terms of style, but you bet it's propaganda. But at the same time, artists were on the projects making easel paintings depicting joblessness, homelessness, shanties. So there was no firm rule. There was nothing like, if you go to the exhibit on Art of Germany, there was no firm rule on what could and could not be produced if you were on the projects. I will point out, and I meant to include this, but then just thought no, a recent effort on the part of the current administration to revive the look of the 1930s in some of the Department of Labor posters. So if you want to have fun this afternoon, go look up Department of Labor posters, and you'll see these amazing posters that have been created in the last year. I gotta believe most of them are AI, which show rugged, manly, and female workers in sort of it looks very Soviet guise of working. And, the comments are great. People are like, this is not America. This looks Soviet. So absolutely it's propaganda, but I also think that there's an edge. So.
I think we have time for maybe one more question before we wrap up.
Thank you so much. This was great. One of the things that I noticed in this wonderful exhibit is the presence of organizations like, the Communist Party, labor unions, and the like. Could you speak just a little bit about how those were defamed and defanged?
There was a lot of organization, alternative organization in the 1930s. Even earlier, the John Reed Club, the Artists Union. And yeah, during the Red Scare of the later 30s, well into the 40s and 50s, they're not only defamed, they're disbanded. And I think Dan was telling me the story about Leon Bibble's flag bearers, in that he painted this painting, which is kind of weird, let's face it, but he was terrified that this painting might get him in trouble. So he not only quit painting, became a chicken farmer, ran a poultry farm for 2 decades, but he hid that painting under his bed. So it only resurfaced in the 1980s or so. So yeah, there was so much laboring of American culture in the 30s. And then with the war and with the return of corporate strength and industrial capitalism, it disappears. So it revives at various moments in American history. But that's what I'm saying. There's no straight line of we love work and we're going to represent work It's really confusing, which leads me to speculate, maybe I've spent my life working with no good reason. So what's the meaning of work? So, but anyhow, thank you so much.